The horse reared without warning, its front legs slashing the air, and every groom near the fence stepped back except for the new stable boy who threw himself forward and caught the loose rein before the animal could bolt toward the kitchen yard. He held on with both hands, his boots dragging through the mud, until the horse settled and stood trembling beside him. Nobody clapped. Nobody thanked him. The head groom only grunted and told him to get back to work before Lord Pelham noticed the commotion. Elara Whitfield had been carrying a basket of mending across the yard when it happened, and she stopped where she stood, her heart still racing from the sight of it. She watched the young man lead the horse away, favoring one arm, saying nothing about the pain that flickered across his face. The other servants had already turned back to their tasks, as if nothing unusual had occurred, as if a man risking injury to save a runaway animal was simply part of the morning routine. She followed him at a distance, not because she meant to pry, but because something in the way he moved troubled her. When she reached the stable door, she found him leaning against a post, gripping his forearm, his jaw tight with pain he refused to voice aloud. "You are hurt," she said. He looked up, startled, as though he had not expected anyone to speak to him with concern rather than command. "It is nothing," he said. "The horse only grazed me. Let me see." He hesitated, clearly unused to anyone offering care instead of orders, but she did not wait for permission. She set down her basket and took his arm gently, turning it toward the light from the stable door. A long red mark ran across his skin, already swelling. She tore a strip of clean linen from the mending in her basket and wrapped it carefully, her fingers steady despite the flush rising in her cheeks. "You did not have to do that," he said quietly. "Neither did you," she answered, nodding toward the yard where the horse now stood calm. "You could have let the others handle it. You could have stepped back like everyone else. Someone had to stop him. Most people would have found a reason not to be that someone." He studied her for a long moment, and something shifted behind his eyes, something she could not name. He had the look of a man who was used to being watched carefully by people who wanted something from him, and he seemed unsure what to do with a kindness that asked for nothing in return. "My name is Elara," she said, when the silence stretched too long. "Tom," he answered, and there was the faintest pause before he said it, so brief she almost missed it. She did not know in that moment that she was the first person on the entire estate to hear him introduce himself, and that everyone else who worked there had simply been told his name upon his arrival, as though he were an object delivered rather than a man who had chosen to speak it himself. Over the following days, Elara noticed things about him that the other staff seemed determined to overlook. He rose earlier than any other groom and worked later than the rest, yet he never complained. He spoke to the horses in a low, steady voice that calmed even the most nervous animals within moments. He carried himself with a stillness that did not match the rough clothes he wore, a stillness she had only ever seen in men who had spent their lives being watched and judged. The other servants treated him with open scorn. Margaret Coyle, the head housekeeper's favorite maid, made a habit of mocking his silence, calling him slow-witted within his hearing, and laughing when he did not respond. The younger footmen shoved past him in the corridors that connected the servants' quarters, and the older grooms gave him the worst tasks without explanation, as if testing how much he would endure before he broke. He never broke. He never argued. He simply did what was asked of him and retreated to the stables each evening, where Elara began to find reasons to linger. She brought him bread when the kitchen had extra. She brought him a worn but warm coat when she noticed him shivering through a cold evening watch over a sick mare. She never made a show of it, never announced her kindness to the others, because she had learned early in her life that kindness given for praise was not truly kindness at all. Her own family had known hardship, and she remembered what it felt like to be looked past, to be treated as though her presence in a room mattered less than the furniture. "Why do you do this?" Tom asked her one evening, when she brought him a small parcel of cheese wrapped in cloth. "Do what?" "Treat me as though I matter." The question struck her harder than she expected. She sat down on an overturned crate near the stable door, watching the last light fade over the fields beyond the fence. "Because you do matter," she said simply. "I do not understand why anyone would need a reason to believe that." He was quiet for a long time after that, long enough that she thought perhaps she had said something wrong. When he finally spoke, his voice had a rough edge to it, as though the words cost him something. "Not everyone believes it," he said, "not about people like me." "Then everyone else is wrong," she said, and she meant it so plainly that he almost smiled, the corner of his mouth lifting before he caught himself and looked away. She did not press him further that night, though she noticed, not for the first time, how carefully he chose his words, how his voice sometimes carried an accent that did not belong to a stable hand, clipped and precise in a way that reminded her of the tutors who had once visited the estate to instruct Lord Pelham's children. She noticed how his hands, though calloused now, moved with a grace that no amount of stable work could teach a man from nothing. There was a moment, a few days later, when she watched him settle a spooked colt that no other groom could approach. He did not raise his voice or reach for a whip the way the older grooms did. He simply stood at a careful distance, speaking low words she could not hear, until the animal's ears turned toward him, and its trembling eased. When he finally touched its neck, the colt leaned into his hand as though it had known him for years. "How did you learn that?" she asked afterward, still amazed by what she had seen. He shrugged, brushing dust from his sleeve. "Animals only want to know they are safe. Once they believe it, everything else becomes easier." "That sounds like something more than stable work." "Perhaps," he said, and offered nothing further, though his eyes lingered on her a moment longer than necessary before he turned back to his tasks. Elara found herself thinking about him often in the days that followed, more than she thought was wise for a woman in her position. She had responsibilities of her own, a family depending on the wages she sent home each month, a father whose health had begun to fail, and a younger sister who still needed guidance. She could not afford to let her thoughts wander toward a stable hand with no name worth mentioning, and no future beyond the yard he worked in. And yet she kept returning to the stables in the evenings, telling herself it was only kindness, only the simple decency any person deserved, even as some quieter part of her recognized it as something more. One evening, as autumn settled cold and early over Pelham Hall, she found Tom sitting alone near the paddock fence, staring out at the darkening fields with an expression she had not seen on him before, something heavier than his usual careful composure. "You look troubled," she said, taking a seat on the fence rail beside him. "I was remembering something," he said. "A different life, a different place. Will you tell me about it?" He was quiet for a long moment, and she thought he might refuse, as he often did when the conversation drew too close to whatever he kept hidden. But instead he spoke, slowly, choosing each word with care. "I once lived somewhere very different from here," he said. "A place with more rooms than people to fill them, more silence than warmth. I thought for a long time that this was simply how the world worked. That some people were meant to be surrounded by comfort and others were meant to serve it. And now I am not so certain of anything I once believed." He glanced at her, and something in his gaze made her breath catch, though she could not have said why. "You have shown me more genuine kindness in a few weeks than I received in years before I came here. I do not know how to repay that." "You do not need to repay it," she said. "Kindness is not a debt. Perhaps not to you," he said quietly. "But to me, it feels like the greatest gift I have ever been given." She did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing, and they sat together in comfortable silence as the last light faded from the sky. Two people from worlds that should never have crossed, drawn together by something neither of them fully understood yet. She told herself it did not matter. Whatever he had been before he arrived at Pelham Hall, whatever secret sat behind his careful silences, he had been kind to her in his own quiet way, and she to him, and for now that seemed enough. But even as she walked back to the servants' quarters that night, the basket empty and her heart strangely light, a small and persistent thought followed her through the dark. No ordinary stable boy carried himself the way Tom did. No ordinary stable boy spoke the way he spoke when he forgot to guard his words. And no ordinary stable boy would have looked at her, in that unguarded moment by the stable door, as though her simple kindness was the rarest thing he had ever been given. She did not know yet what that meant. She only knew that something had begun that evening, something neither of them could stop now that it had started, and that the quiet stable hand with the careful eyes was not entirely who he claimed to be. Somewhere beyond the estate walls, in a manor house far grander than Pelham Hall, servants were already preparing rooms for a visit that would change everything, dusting portraits of a young duke who had not been seen in society for nearly a year, a duke who had vanished from his own household without explanation, and left his staff whispering about where their master had gone. None of them thought to look for him in a stable, mucking out stalls under a name that was not his own. Elara certainly never imagined it. But as she lay awake that night, listening to the wind move through the trees outside her window, she found herself thinking of Tom's careful voice, his guarded eyes, and the strange dignity he carried, even while performing the lowest tasks on the estate, and she wondered, just for a moment, who he truly was beneath the mud and the silence. She would not have to wonder for much longer. Margaret Coyle slammed the washroom door hard enough to rattle the shelves, her face twisted with fury as she rounded on Elara before she had even set down her basin of water. "Everyone is talking about you," Margaret hissed, "sneaking off to the stables every night like some common girl chasing after a boy who mucks out stalls for a living. Have you no shame at all?" Elara kept her expression calm, though her pulse quickened. "I bring him food when there is extra, that is all. That is all, Margaret repeated, her voice dripping with mockery. You forget yourself, Alara Whitfield. You were raised better than this, or so I thought. A stable hand is beneath even you, and you were born with nothing. The words stung more than Alara wanted to admit, but she refused to let it show. Kindness is not beneath anyone, Margaret. Perhaps you should try it sometime. Margaret's eyes narrowed, and she left without another word, but Alara knew the conversation would not end there. Word traveled fast among the servants of Pelham Hall, and by the time she reached the kitchen for her morning duties, she could feel the weight of curious glances following her, whispers trailing behind her like smoke. She tried to ignore it, focusing instead on her work, but the whispers grew louder as the day went on. The estate itself had grown busier in recent days, staff scrubbing floors that were already clean, polishing silver that already gleamed, preparing guest rooms that had stood empty for months. Something important was coming, though no one below the housekeeper's rank had been told exactly what. The Duke is finally to visit, Mrs. Fenwick, the head housekeeper announced that evening to the assembled staff, her voice tight with the particular anxiety of someone whose entire household depended on making a good impression. Lord Pelham has arranged a match between his daughter and his Grace, and the Duke intends to inspect the estate before any formal agreement is signed. Every corner of this house must be perfect. Every member of staff must conduct themselves with the utmost propriety. Is that understood? A murmur of agreement passed through the room, and Alara felt a strange unease settle over her, though she could not explain why the announcement troubled her so deeply. She told herself it was simply the pressure of extra work now expected of everyone, the added scrutiny that came with a noble visitor of such importance. Later that night, in the small room she shared with two other maids, Alara overheard fragments of conversation drifting through the thin wall from the corridor outside. Two footmen were speaking in low voices about the Duke, about rumors that had followed him for over a year, whispers of a young nobleman who had disappeared from his own estate without warning, leaving his staff and his distant relatives to manage his affairs in his absence. They say he simply vanished, one footman murmured. No word to anyone, not even his own steward. Some think he grew tired of the endless demands of his title. Others say something darker happened, though no one speaks of it openly. And now he reappears, ready to marry Lord Pelham's daughter, as though nothing at all occurred. The second footman replied, skepticism heavy in his voice. Strange business, if you ask me. Alara lay very still, listening, her mind turning over the fragments of gossip long after the footmen's voices faded down the corridor. A Duke who had vanished for over a year. A stable hand who carried himself with unmistakable authority, and who a visiting steward had nearly addressed by a title far above his claimed station. The pieces refused to fit together neatly, and yet some quiet, insistent part of her mind kept trying to arrange them into a shape she was not ready to see clearly. She told herself she was imagining things, weaving a fanciful story out of coincidence and rumor, the way servants throughout the estate loved to do whenever excitement disrupted their routine. And yet sleep did not come easily that night, her thoughts circling back again and again to Tom's careful eyes and guarded silences. The following morning brought fresh demands from Mrs. Fenwick, who moved through the halls like a general preparing for battle, assigning tasks with sharp precision and little patience for error. Alara found herself pulled from her usual duties to help air out the grandest guest chambers, chambers that had not been used in years, their furniture draped in dust cloths that needed to be removed and washed before the Duke's arrival. As she worked, she could not stop thinking about the conversation she had overheard, nor about the strange moment with the visiting steward. She wanted desperately to speak with Tom again, to ask him plainly what he was hiding, but the day's demands kept her occupied well past sunset, and by the time she finally had a free moment, exhaustion pulled at her limbs like a physical weight. Still, she found herself walking toward the stables anyway, unable to stay away, carrying a small parcel of bread as she always did, though her true purpose that evening had little to do with food. But that evening, when she carried a small parcel of bread to the stables as she often did, she found Tom in a state she had never seen before. He was pacing near the paddock fence, his jaw tight, his hands clenched at his sides. "Is something wrong?" she asked. He stopped pacing and looked at her, and for a moment she saw something raw and unguarded in his expression before he composed himself again. "I heard about the Duke's visit," he said carefully. "All the estate has heard of it. Mrs. Fenwick has us all scrubbing until our hands ache. Does it trouble you?" he asked. "The idea of Lord Pelham's daughter marrying a Duke she has likely never met?" Alara considered the question, surprised he had asked it at all. Most people of his station, or the station he claimed, would not have thought to ask her opinion on matters so far above their lives. "It troubles me that such matches are often made without any concern for whether two people could ever care for one another, but it is not my place to question how the nobility arranges its affairs." And if it were your place, he pressed, what would you say? I would say that a marriage built only on rank and fortune is a lonely thing, no matter how grand the house it is built within. She studied him closely. Why does this matter so much to you, Tom? He looked away, toward the darkening fields, and did not answer for a long moment. I have seen what such marriages do to people, he said finally. I have seen the loneliness you speak of, up close, in a way I hope you never have to witness yourself. She wanted to ask him how a stable hand had come to witness the private sorrows of noble marriages, but something in his tone told her the question would not be welcome, not yet. Instead, she changed the subject, and they spent the rest of the evening speaking of smaller things. The changing weather, the horses he cared for, a story from her childhood that made him laugh, a real laugh, warm and unguarded, the first she had heard from him since his arrival. It was during that laugh that she noticed something odd. A visiting steward from a neighboring estate, delivering a message for Lord Pelham, passed near the stable yard and caught sight of Tom. The steward stopped mid-stride, his eyes widening with unmistakable recognition. Your Grace, the steward began, bowing low before catching himself with a look of confusion, glancing between Tom's stable clothes and his own memory as though trying to reconcile the two. Tom's face went pale, and he stepped forward quickly, cutting the steward off before he could say anything further. You are mistaken, Tom said, his voice suddenly sharp and commanding, in a way Alara had never heard from him before, a tone that brooked no argument. I am simply a groom here. You must be thinking of someone else. The steward blinked, uncertain, but something in Tom's bearing, the sudden authority in his stance, seemed to convince him to let the matter drop. He mumbled an apology and hurried away toward the main house, leaving Alara standing frozen by the paddock fence, her mind racing over what she had just witnessed. Your Grace, she repeated slowly, turning to face him. Why would he call you that? Tom's expression had shuddered completely, the warmth from moments before replaced by careful, guarded stillness. He was mistaken, as I said. Perhaps he has seen someone who resembles me. Tom. She stepped closer, searching his face for the truth she could feel hovering just beneath the surface. Please, whatever you are hiding, I would rather hear it from you than continue guessing in the dark. For a moment, she thought he might finally tell her everything. His eyes softened, and his hand moved as though he meant to reach for hers, but then he pulled back, and the careful mask settled over his features once more. There is nothing to tell, he said quietly. I am only Tom, a groom who cares for horses and nothing more. She did not believe him, not for a single moment, but she saw the fear behind his denial, the desperate need to keep whatever secret he carried buried a little longer, and something in her softened despite her suspicion. Very well, she said. But I am not a fool, Tom. Whatever this is, I will discover it eventually. I know, he said softly, and there was something almost like sorrow in his voice, as though he already knew how the truth, once revealed, might change everything between them. She left him standing alone by the paddock that night, her mind full of questions she could not yet answer, and behind her, though she did not see it, Tom watched her go with an expression of such quiet longing that it would have broken her heart to witness it. Before she reached the stable that evening, she encountered her younger friend Grace, a scullery maid who had always been generous with news gathered from below stairs. Grace caught her arm in the corridor, eyes bright with the thrill of fresh gossip. Have you heard? Grace whispered. Lord Pelham's daughter is furious about the match. She says she has never even exchanged a single letter with the Duke, only arrangements made through solicitors and family connections. She says she would rather marry a farmer she loved than a Duke she has never met. Can you blame her? Ilara asked quietly. Grace shrugged. I would take a Duke over a farmer any day, met or not met. Think of the gowns, Ilara, the jewels, the grand house. She laughed, but then her expression turned more serious. Though I suppose you are right, it does seem a lonely way to begin a marriage. Ilara thought of Tom's words from days before, his warning about the loneliness such arranged matches often produced, and she wondered again how a stable hand had come to understand such things so intimately. You look troubled, Grace said, studying her face. Is this about the stable hand everyone whispers of? Margaret has been telling anyone who will listen that you have lost all sense where he is concerned. Margaret enjoys inventing scandal where none exists, Ilara replied, though her cheeks warmed slightly. Perhaps, Grace said, though her tone suggested she was not entirely convinced. Just be careful, Ilara. Whatever kindness you feel toward him, remember that a stable hand has little to offer beyond his current position. I would hate to see you hurt. Ilara thanked her friend for the concern, though she could not shake the feeling that Grace's warning, however well-intentioned, missed something important about the man she had grown to care for. Whatever Tom truly was, stable hand or something else entirely, she had never once doubted the sincerity in his eyes when he spoke with her. And sincerity, she believed, could not be so easily manufactured. The Duke's arrival was now only weeks away, and with it, Elara sensed, would come a truth that neither of them could keep hidden much longer. That night, as she lay in her narrow bed listening to the wind rattle the shutters, she thought back over every strange detail she had noticed since Tom's arrival. The way he spoke when he forgot to guard his words, the authority in his voice when he corrected the steward, the grace in his movements that no stable work could have taught him. Pieces of a puzzle she had refused to fully examine, because examining them meant confronting a possibility too strange and too frightening to consider. She refused to believe it, and yet, lying awake in the darkness, she could not stop herself from wondering if the man she had grown to care for, the quiet stable hand who listened to her as no one else ever had, might be someone entirely different from who he claimed to be. Someone whose true name, when spoken aloud, would change everything between them forever. A letter arrived for Elara that morning, and the moment she recognized her sister's handwriting on the envelope, her stomach tightened with dread. She tore it open in the privacy of the linen closet, her hands trembling as she read the hurried lines, and by the time she finished, tears blurred her vision. Her father's health had worsened. The small debt the family carried, one they had struggled against for years, had grown beyond anything they could manage. Her sister wrote of a merchant threatening to seize what little property remained, of their father too weak now to work, of desperation creeping into every line of the letter despite Clara's attempt to sound brave. Elara folded the letter carefully and pressed it against her chest, trying to steady her breathing. She had sent home nearly every coin of her wages for years, and still it was not enough. She did not know what more she could do, working the long hours she already worked, earning the modest sum a lady's companion could expect. She thought of her father, Edmund Whitfield, a man who had once run a small workshop crafting fine leather goods before illness stole the strength from his hands. She remembered him teaching her to read by candlelight when she was young, his patience endless despite the exhaustion of his long working days. He had always told her that character mattered more than circumstance, that a person's worth could never be measured by the size of their purse or the grandness of their home. She had carried those words with her through every hardship since, but now, faced with the possibility of losing what little remained of her family's security, she felt those words tested more severely than ever before. Her sister Clara was only 16, too young to carry the burden that had fallen upon her in their father's illness, managing the household accounts and fending off the merchant's increasingly aggressive demands for payment. Elara pictured her sister's frightened handwriting, the way the ink had smudged in places as though tears had fallen upon the page while she wrote, and guilt settled heavily in her chest. She was the elder daughter, the one who was supposed to protect her family, and yet she felt utterly powerless to help them from so far away. She splashed cold water on her face in the washroom, trying to compose herself before returning to her duties, but the weight of the letter remained lodged in her chest like a stone throughout the rest of the day. She moved through her tasks mechanically, barely registering the mending in her hands or the instructions called out by Mrs. Fenwick, her mind consumed entirely by thoughts of her family's desperate situation. That evening, unable to keep the weight of it to herself any longer, she found herself at the stables once more, and Tom noticed immediately that something was wrong. "What has happened?" he asked, setting down the bridle he had been mending. She hesitated, embarrassed by her own tears, but something about his steady, patient gaze made the words spill out before she could stop them. She told him about her father's failing health, about the debt threatening to take what little her family had left, about her fear that no matter how hard she worked, it would never be enough to save them. Tom listened without interruption, his expression growing darker with every word, though his anger seemed directed not at her, but at the circumstances themselves, at a world that could press so cruelly upon a family that had done nothing to deserve it. "How much is the debt?" he asked when she finished. She told him the sum, and something flickered across his face, an expression she could not quite name, gone before she could examine it closely. "That is a significant amount," he said carefully. "It might as well be a fortune," she said. "I do not know how we will manage it." He was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the darkened paddock, his jaw working as though he were fighting some internal battle she could not see. "Elara," he said finally, "I want you to know that whatever happens, I will do everything within my power to help your family. I promise you that." She looked at him, startled by the intensity in his voice. "Tom, you are a stable hand. Whatever kindness you offer, however genuine, you have no more resources than I do. Please, do not make promises you cannot keep. It would only make things harder to bear." Something like pain crossed his features then, quick and sharp, and he looked away from her, toward the horses shifting quietly in their stalls. "You are right to doubt me," he said softly. "I have given you little reason to believe I could offer real help. But I ask you to trust me a little longer, even without understanding why. Why should I trust a man who will not tell me who he truly is?" The words came out sharper than she intended, months of quiet suspicion finally breaking through her careful composure. "Tom, I have watched you for weeks now. I have seen the way you speak when you forget to guard your words. The authority in your voice when that steward nearly called you by a title no stable hand should ever hear. I am not a fool. Something is not right about the story you have told me, and I deserve to know the truth, especially now, when my family's future hangs by such a thin thread." He turned back to her, and for the first time since she had known him, his careful composure crumbled entirely, revealing something raw and conflicted beneath. "You deserve far more than I have given you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Every day, I do not tell you the truth. I feel the weight of that deception more heavily. But Alara, if I tell you now, everything changes, not just for me, but for you as well. I need you to understand that, before I say anything more." Her heart pounded against her ribs. "What do you mean everything changes?" "I mean that the moment you know who I truly am, you will never again be able to look at me the way you look at me now. You will see a title before you see a man. You will wonder, as everyone eventually wonders, whether my kindness toward you has been genuine or merely a performance staged for some purpose you cannot yet imagine. I could not bear that, Alara, not from you, not when you are the only person who has ever looked at me and seen simply a man, nothing more and nothing less." Tears welled in her eyes again, though this time not from grief over her family's troubles, but from the raw honesty in his voice, the vulnerability he had never shown her before. "Tom," she said softly, "nothing you tell me could change what I already know about your character. I have watched you show kindness to animals no one else could calm. I have watched you endure cruelty from the other staff without ever once responding with cruelty of your own. I have watched you listen to my troubles as though they mattered as much as any noble concern. Whatever title you carry or do not carry, none of that changes the man I have come to know." He looked at her for a long moment, something desperate and hopeful warring in his expression, and she thought, for one breathless instant, that he might finally tell her everything. But before he could speak, the stable door creaked open, and Henry Dobbs, the estate's senior steward, stepped inside, his face pale and urgent. "Tom," Henry said, his voice carrying an odd mixture of respect and nervousness that Alara had never heard directed at a mere stable hand before. "A rider has arrived from the capital with an urgent message. He says it concerns matters that cannot wait." Tom's entire demeanor shifted in an instant, the vulnerable man from moments before replaced by someone sharper, more alert, carrying himself with the unmistakable bearing of someone accustomed to command. "Send him to the old gatehouse," Tom said. "I will meet him there directly. Tell no one else he has arrived." Henry nodded and hurried away, and Alara stood frozen, watching the transformation with growing certainty that everything she had suspected was true. "Tom," she whispered, "who are you truly?" He turned to her, and for a moment, the desperate longing in his eyes told her everything words could not yet express. "I am someone who cares for you more deeply than I have any right to," he said, "and I am someone who must ask you, one final time, to trust me a little longer. I promise you, Alara, the truth is coming, sooner than either of us expected. But I need to handle what is happening now, before I can give you the answers you deserve." She wanted to argue, wanted to demand the truth immediately, but something in his expression, some desperate plea beneath the urgency, made her nod instead. "Go," she said quietly. "But Tom, I meant what I said. Whatever you are, whoever you are, it will not change what I feel. Just please, do not let it be something that hurts my family further. I do not think I could bear that." "It will not hurt them," he said firmly. "I swear that to you." He left her standing alone in the stable, and she watched him disappear into the darkness toward the old gatehouse, his stride purposeful and commanding in a way that confirmed everything she had begun to suspect. She did not sleep well that night, her mind racing through every possibility, every fragment of evidence she had gathered over the past weeks. She thought of Henry Dobbs bowing his head slightly when he addressed Tom, a gesture too small for most to notice but unmistakable to anyone paying close attention. She thought of the steward who had nearly called him by a title reserved for only the highest ranks of nobility. She thought of his hands, calloused now but still carrying the trained precision of someone who had learned fine penmanship and delicate tasks long before he ever touched a horse's bridle. Piece by piece, the picture forming in her mind grew clearer, though she resisted its full shape with everything in her, afraid of what it might mean. afraid of how completely it would transform the fragile, precious understanding she had built with the man she called Tom. If her suspicions were correct, if he truly was connected to the Duke whose arrival the entire household now prepared for with such frantic energy, then everything between them would change in ways she could not yet predict. Would a Duke, once revealed, still see her as anything more than a servant girl who had shown him kindness out of simple human decency? Would the connection she felt so certain of prove to be nothing more than a fleeting comfort he sought during whatever strange circumstance had driven him to hide his identity? A comfort he would discard easily once his true life resumed. She pushed the thought away, unwilling to let it take root, but it lingered at the edges of her mind regardless, a quiet fear she could not fully banish. When morning came, she rose early, exhausted but resolute, determined to find Tom and demand answers regardless of the consequences. But when she reached the stables, she found only the other grooms going about their usual work, and no sign of Tom anywhere among them. "Where is Tom?" she asked one of the younger stable hands, trying to keep the worry from her voice. The boy shrugged. "Gone before dawn, miss. Said he had urgent business to attend to. Did not say where or when he would return." Alara's stomach twisted with a fear she could not fully name. Had something happened during his meeting with the mysterious rider the night before? Had the truth he promised to reveal somehow put him in danger, or worse, convinced him to disappear entirely rather than face whatever consequences honesty might bring? She threw herself into her duties that day, trying to distract herself from the growing anxiety gnawing at her thoughts, but every free moment found her glancing toward the stables, hoping against hope to see his familiar figure among the horses. He did not return that day, nor the next. By the third day, whispers had begun circulating through the estate about the missing stable hand, though most dismissed it as unremarkable, servants coming and going being nothing unusual on a large estate. Only Alara understood the deeper significance of his absence. The way it confirmed something urgent and important had called him away, something connected to the secret he had carried since his arrival. On the fourth morning, as preparations for the Duke's arrival reached their final frantic pitch throughout the household, Mrs. Fenwick gathered the entire staff in the main hall for a final briefing before the great day arrived. "His Grace will arrive tomorrow evening," she announced, her voice tight with nervous anticipation. "Every member of this household will conduct themselves with perfect propriety. There will be no exceptions, no excuses. Is that understood?" The staff murmured their agreement, and Alara stood among them, her heart heavy with worry over Tom's continued absence, her mind still turning over every clue she had gathered, every unguarded moment that had hinted at a truth far larger than she had initially imagined. She did not yet know how close she stood to discovering that truth, nor how completely it would upend everything she believed about the quiet, kind stable hand who had shown her more genuine warmth than anyone else on the entire estate. That afternoon, as she helped arrange fresh flowers in the grand entrance hall, Grace found her again, her face flushed with excitement mixed with concern. "They say the Duke's own carriage was spotted on the eastern road," Grace whispered, setting down a vase of white roses. "Mrs. Fenwick nearly fainted from the shock of it arriving a day early. The whole kitchen is in an uproar." Alara's hands stilled over the flowers she had been arranging. "A day early? Are they certain?" "Certain enough that Mrs. Fenwick has ordered every candle lit and every fire built up before nightfall, just in case." Grace studied her friend's pale face with growing concern. "Alara, you look as though you have seen a ghost. Is this still about the missing stable hand?" "I do not know what it is about," Alara admitted quietly, though privately she suspected the truth was drawing closer with every passing hour, close enough now that she could almost feel it pressing against the edges of her understanding, waiting only for the right moment to break fully into the light. "Well, whatever troubles you, set it aside for now," Grace said, squeezing her arm gently. "We have a Duke to prepare for, and Mrs. Fenwick will have our heads if these flowers are not perfect before he arrives." Alara nodded and returned to her work, though her thoughts remained fixed on the eastern road and whatever carriage now traveled along it, carrying toward Pelham Hall a truth she had both longed for and dreaded in equal measure. Tomorrow, the Duke would arrive at Pelham Hall, and Alara could not shake the growing certainty that when he did, the man she had grown to care for so deeply would be standing at the center of it all. The carriage wheels crunched against the gravel drive just as the last light faded from the sky, and every servant in Pelham Hall froze mid-task at the sound, a collective breath held throughout the entire household. Alara stood near the entrance hall with the other staff, arranged in careful rows as Mrs. Fenwick had instructed, her heart hammering so loudly she feared others might hear it. Lord Pelham and his daughter descended the front steps to greet their guest personally, and Alara watched from her position among the servants as the carriage door opened. A man stepped out, dressed in fine dark clothing that fit him with the precision only expert tailoring could provide, his bearing unmistakably commanding as he greeted his hosts with practiced courtesy. Ilara's breath caught in her throat, her eyes fixed on his face, searching for the features she had come to know so well. It was not Tom. The man was older, perhaps 40 years of age, with a stern expression and graying hair at his temples, nothing like the young stable hand who had captured her heart over the past weeks. Confusion rippled through her, followed swiftly by a strange mixture of relief and disappointment she could not fully untangle. "Lord Pelham," the visitor said, his voice deep and formal, "allow me to introduce myself properly. I am Baron Ashworth, sent ahead by His Grace to ensure all arrangements meet his approval before his own arrival tomorrow. He sends his apologies for the delay and asks that preparations continue as planned." Ilara's mind raced. If this man was merely an advance envoy, then the Duke himself had not yet arrived, and Tom's whereabouts remained as mysterious as ever. She glanced toward Mrs. Fenwick, who was already ushering the Baron inside with elaborate courtesy, the entire household staff falling into practiced motion to attend to his needs. Throughout dinner service that evening, Ilara moved through her duties with practiced efficiency, though her mind remained fixed on the mystery of Tom's absence. She overheard fragments of conversation among the senior staff as they hurried between the kitchen and dining hall, most of it concerning the Baron's particular preferences and the exacting standards he expected the household to meet before his master's own arrival. Margaret Coyle found reason to needle her once more as they passed each other near the kitchen stairs. "I hear your stable hand has run off entirely," Margaret said with poorly concealed satisfaction. "Perhaps he grew tired of your attentions, or perhaps he simply realized he had no place among decent company to begin with. Either way, you would do well to forget him before the household finishes laughing at your expense." Ilara bit back the sharp reply that rose to her lips, unwilling to give Margaret the satisfaction of a reaction, and continued on her way without a word. She had grown accustomed to Margaret's cruelty over the weeks, though it stung no less for its familiarity. That evening, as the excitement of the Baron's arrival gradually settled into the routine business of hosting an important guest, Ilara found a moment to slip away toward the stables, desperate for any news of Tom's return. She found the head groom tending to the horses alone, and her heart sank further when he confirmed that Tom had still not returned. "Strange business," the groom muttered, shaking his head. "A stable hand vanishing without notice, right before the Duke's own visit. If he does not return by tomorrow, Mrs. Fenwick will have his position given to someone more reliable." Ilara's stomach twisted with worry, though she said nothing, unwilling to reveal how deeply the news affected her. She returned to her duties that night with a heavy heart, questions circling endlessly through her mind, without any answers to settle them. The following day brought fresh chaos to Pelham Hall as final preparations reached their peak intensity. Ilara found herself assigned to assist in the grand dining hall, arranging place settings with meticulous care under Mrs. Fenwick's watchful eye, when Henry Dobbs approached her with an unusual request. "Miss Whitfield," he said quietly, drawing her slightly aside from the other staff, "I wonder if you might assist with a small errand. There are fresh linens needed in the eastern guest chamber, the one being prepared for His Grace's personal use. Would you mind delivering them?" She agreed readily, grateful for any excuse to move away from the tense atmosphere of the dining hall, and carried the folded linens up the grand staircase toward the chamber Henry had indicated. As she approached the door, she overheard voices within, one belonging to Baron Ashworth, the other unfamiliar but carrying an unmistakable air of authority. "The arrangements have been made precisely as you instructed, Your Grace," Baron Ashworth was saying. "No one suspects a thing. Your time observing the estate incognito has given you exactly the insight you sought." Ilara froze outside the door, the linens nearly slipping from her arms as the meaning of the words settled over her like cold water. "And the girl?" the second voice asked, and her heart stopped entirely, because she recognized that voice, would have recognized it anywhere. The careful cadence now unguarded, and confident in a way she had only glimpsed in rare unguarded moments. It was Tom. "What of her?" Baron Ashworth asked. "I need to know she is protected, regardless of what happens next," Tom said, his voice carrying a weight of concern that made Ilara's chest ache. "Her family's debt must be resolved quietly, without her knowledge of my involvement, at least for now. And I want assurances that no harm comes to her position here, whatever the household staff might think of her friendship with a supposed stable hand." Ilara pressed her hand against her mouth to stifle the sound that threatened to escape her, tears blurring her vision as understanding crashed over her fully at last. Tom was the Duke. He had been the Duke all along, living among the estate's lowest servants under a false name, observing the household, learning who among them possessed genuine kindness and who did not. And she had been the only one who had shown him warmth without knowing, without expecting anything in return. The realization brought with it a confusing tangle of emotions, gratitude and wonder, tangled together with something sharper, something that felt uncomfortably close to betrayal. He had let her believe a lie for weeks, had allowed her to care for a man who did not fully exist, while the truth of his identity remained hidden behind careful silences and half-answers. She could not stand there listening any longer. She set the linens down carefully outside the door and hurried away, before anyone inside could discover her presence, her thoughts spinning too rapidly to process clearly. She hurried down the servants' staircase, her mind replaying every moment of their friendship in a new and unsettling light. The evening he had calmed the spooked colt with nothing more than a low voice and patient hands, a skill that suddenly made perfect sense for a man who had likely been trained since childhood in every aspect of estate management, including the care of fine horses. The evening he had spoken of loneliness within arranged marriages with such intimate understanding, knowledge that could only have come from his own approaching betrothal to Lord Pelham's daughter, the steward who had nearly addressed him by his proper title, an error that had nearly unraveled his careful disguise weeks before it was meant to end. She thought of every kindness she had shown him, every small comfort she had offered without expectation, and wondered now whether any of it had mattered to him in the way she had believed, or whether she had simply been a curiosity to a bored nobleman playing at being ordinary for a season. The thought made her chest ache with a hurt sharper than she expected, and she quickened her pace toward the garden, needing air and space to gather her scattered thoughts before she could face anyone else. She found herself in the servants' garden a short while later, sitting on a stone bench beneath a bare oak tree, tears finally spilling freely down her cheeks, as the full weight of the revelation settled over her. She did not know whether to feel joy at learning the man she cared for held such power to help her family, or hurt at the deception that had shaped every moment of their friendship. Footsteps approached, and she looked up to find Tom standing before her, no longer dressed in stable clothes but in the fine attire befitting his true station, though his expression carried the same gentle concern she had always known from him. "Ilara," he said softly, "I did not want you to learn the truth this way." "How did you want me to learn it then?" she asked, her voice trembling with a mixture of hurt and disbelief. "After weeks of watching me care for a man who apparently never truly existed." "I exist," he said firmly, stepping closer. "Everything you knew of me, every conversation, every moment of honesty between us, that was real, Ilara. Only my name and my station were hidden, not my heart. You let me believe you were nothing more than a stable hand," she said, rising from the bench, anger now mixing with her tears. "You let the entire household mock and mistreat you while you observed us all like specimens under glass. Was that amusing to you, Your Grace? Watching a servant girl bring you bread and mend your wounds, never knowing you could have summoned an army of servants with a single word?" "It was never amusing," he said, and the raw pain in his voice made her pause despite her anger. "I came here because I no longer trusted the people surrounding me at my own estate, flatterers and schemers who valued my title far more than my character. I wanted, just once, to know what it felt like to be seen as a man rather than a title, to discover who among Lord Pelham's household possessed genuine goodness rather than practiced courtesy performed for advantage." "And did you find what you were searching for?" she asked bitterly. "I found you," he said simply, and the quiet sincerity in his voice broke through some of her anger, though not enough to fully calm the storm of emotions still raging within her. "I found someone who showed me kindness with absolutely nothing to gain from it, who treated me with dignity when everyone else offered only cruelty. Ilara, you are the reason I finally understand what genuine goodness looks like, and I did not know how to tell you the truth without risking the loss of that genuine connection." She wanted to believe him, wanted desperately to trust the sincerity radiating from every word he spoke, but the shock of the revelation still overwhelmed her, and she needed distance to process everything that had changed in the span of a single conversation, overheard through a closed door. "I need time," she said finally, stepping back from him. "Please, Tom, or whatever I should call you now. I need time to understand what any of this means." Pain flickered across his features, but he nodded, respecting her request, despite the visible cost it took him. "Take whatever time you need," he said quietly. "But know this, Ilara Whitfield, my feelings for you have not changed simply because you now know my true name. If anything, they have only grown stronger, watching you show such grace, even in the face of this discovery." She turned and walked away from him then, her mind and heart in complete turmoil, leaving him standing alone beneath the bare oak tree, as the last light of day faded into evening around them. Tomorrow, the household would learn officially what she now knew privately. Tomorrow, The stable hand called Tom would formally reveal himself as Julian Ashford, Duke of Ravensworth. And Alara did not know, walking back toward the servants' quarters with tears still drying on her cheeks, how she would face the moment when the entire household discovered what she had known for hours already, nor how she would reconcile the aching hurt of his deception with the undeniable warmth still lingering in her heart despite everything. She passed Grace in the corridor, who took one look at her tear-streaked face and immediately drew her into an empty linen room, concern etched across her features. "Alara, what has happened? You look as though your entire world has turned upside down." "It has," Alara admitted quietly, though she could not yet bring herself to share the full truth, unsure how to even begin explaining something so strange and overwhelming. "I cannot speak of it now, Grace. Please, just trust that I will explain when I am able." Grace studied her friend's face for a long moment before nodding, squeezing her hand gently. "Whatever it is, I am here when you are ready. And Alara, whatever has hurt you so deeply, I hope you remember that you deserve honesty and kindness in equal measure from anyone who claims to care for you." Alara managed a small, grateful smile, though the words lingered in her mind, long after Grace had returned to her own duties. She deserved honesty, yes, but she also understood now, turning the revelation over again in her thoughts, that Tom's deception had not come from malice or carelessness, but from a genuine fear of losing the one honest connection he had found in a life otherwise governed by suspicion and performance. That understanding did not erase the hurt entirely, but it softened the sharp edges of her anger into something more complicated, something she would need the night's solitude to fully untangle before facing whatever tomorrow would bring. Alara had spent the entire day in quiet turmoil, moving through her duties like someone caught in a fog, unable to shake the memory of the conversation she had overheard the previous evening, nor the tender words Tom, or Julian, had spoken to her afterward beneath the bare oak tree. She had not slept, her mind circling endlessly through every possible outcome the coming evening might bring. Grace found her in the linen room that afternoon, folding the same stack of towels for the third time without noticing her own repetition. "Alara, you have not heard a word I have said in the past 5 minutes," Grace observed, gently taking the towels from her hands. "Whatever is troubling you, it has clearly not resolved itself overnight." "I cannot speak of it yet," Alara said, though the strain in her voice betrayed how close she stood to breaking her silence entirely. "Tonight, everything will become clear, Grace. I promise I will explain then, once I understand it myself." Grace studied her carefully, but did not press further, sensing the depth of whatever burden her friend carried. "Whatever it is, I hope it brings you peace rather than more sorrow." "You deserve peace, Alara, after everything you have endured this past month." The words lingered with Alara throughout the remainder of the day, as she helped with the final preparations for the evening's formal gathering, her hands moving through familiar tasks while her mind remained fixed entirely on the moment still to come. She dressed in her plainest, most respectable uniform that evening, uncertain what proper attire one wore to witness the public unveiling of a secret she alone among the servants already understood. The great hall of Pelham Hall blazed with candlelight as every member of the household, family and staff alike, gathered for the formal announcement of the Duke's arrival. Alara stood among the servants near the back of the hall, her hands clasped tightly together, her heart pounding with dread over what was about to unfold. Lord Pelham stepped forward first, his voice carrying easily through the hushed assembly. "Tonight, we welcome His Grace, Julian Ashford, Duke of Ravensworth, to Pelham Hall. His visit marks the beginning of what we hope will be a most fortunate union between our families." A murmur of anticipation swept through the room, and then the great doors at the far end of the hall opened, and Tom stepped through them, though he was no longer Tom, no longer the quiet stable hand in worn clothes and mud-stained boots. He stood tall in formal attire befitting his rank, his bearing commanding and unmistakably noble. Every trace of the humble groom vanished entirely beneath the polish of his true station. Gasps rippled through the assembled servants as recognition dawned across dozens of faces simultaneously. Margaret Coyle's mouth fell open in shock, her face draining of color as understanding crashed over her. The other grooms who had mocked and mistreated him exchanged horrified glances, their casual cruelty toward a man they now realized held absolute power over their positions suddenly weighing heavily upon them. "It cannot be," someone whispered near Alara, and she recognized the voice as belonging to one of the footmen who had shoved past Tom carelessly in the corridors, treating him with open disdain for weeks. Julian Ashford surveyed the room slowly, his gaze moving deliberately across the assembled staff, and when it finally settled on Alara, something softened in his expression, though he did not single her out, maintaining the composed dignity his position demanded. "I owe this household an explanation," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent hall. "For the past several weeks, I have lived among you as a stable hand, observing this estate and its people, without the burden of my title influencing how I was treated. I did this not out of cruelty or deception intended to harm anyone, but out of a genuine desire to understand the true character of those who might one day serve in my own household, and to witness firsthand the values held by the family whose daughter I am asked to consider for marriage." He paused, letting his words settle over the stunned assembly. "I have learned a great deal during my time here. I have witnessed cruelty disguised as authority, mockery aimed at those perceived as powerless, and a willingness among some to mistreat anyone believed incapable of consequence." His gaze moved briefly, deliberately, toward Margaret and the grooms who had treated him so poorly, and several of them visibly flinched under the weight of his attention. "But I have also witnessed something far more valuable," he continued, and his voice softened noticeably. "I have witnessed genuine kindness, offered freely and without expectation of reward, from someone who believed she was simply extending basic human decency to a stranger in need." Every eye in the hall turned toward Alara, and she felt her face flush crimson under the sudden weight of attention, wishing desperately for the floor to open beneath her and swallow her whole. "Miss Alara Whitfield," Julian said, and hearing her full name spoken aloud in his formal voice sent a strange shiver through her, "showed me more genuine compassion during my time as a supposed stable hand than I have received in years of navigating noble society. She brought me food when I was hungry. She tended my injuries when I was hurt. She listened to my troubles as though they mattered, without once seeking anything in return beyond simple friendship. I do not believe she yet understands how profoundly that kindness affected me." Ilara's heart pounded so violently she feared she might faint from the sheer intensity of the moment. Every servant in the hall now staring at her with expressions ranging from shock to open envy to grudging respect. "I did not do anything remarkable," she managed to say, her voice barely carrying across the silent hall. "I simply treated a man with the dignity every person deserves." "And that," Julian said, stepping closer to where she stood, "is precisely what made it remarkable. Kindness offered without expectation of reward is the rarest gift one person can give another, Miss Whitfield, and I do not intend to let that gift go unacknowledged." Lord Pelham cleared his throat uncomfortably, clearly uncertain how to navigate this unexpected turn in what was meant to be a formal, ceremonial evening. "Your Grace," he said carefully, "surely the matter of your betrothal to my daughter remains the primary purpose of this visit." Julian turned to address Lord Pelham directly, his expression composed but firm. "Lord Pelham, I have great respect for your daughter, and I do not wish to cause her any distress through what I am about to say. But I came to this estate seeking to understand not only the character of those who might serve me, but also to reflect honestly on whether an arranged marriage built solely on family alliance and fortune could ever bring genuine happiness to either party involved. I have spent this past year traveling incognito precisely because I grew weary of relationships built on title and advantage rather than genuine connection." Lord Pelham's daughter, standing near her father with a carefully composed expression that could not fully hide her relief, said nothing, though Alara noticed the slight easing of tension in her shoulders at the Duke's words. "I do not wish to embarrass your family, Lord Pelham," Julian continued, "and I remain willing to discuss whatever arrangements might serve both our interests honorably. But I cannot in good conscience proceed with a formal betrothal built upon obligation alone, not when I have discovered, during my time here, what genuine connection actually feels like." The hall fell into stunned silence, every servant and family member alike absorbing the implications of what the Duke had just declared publicly, before the assembled family and their most senior guests. Ilara stood frozen, scarcely able to breathe, as she realized the full weight of what was unfolding before her. Mrs. Fenwick, standing near the front of the servants' assembly, looked as though she might faint entirely from the shock of the evening's revelations, her carefully maintained composure finally cracking under the strain of watching her household's careful plans dissolve so publicly. Lord Pelham, to his credit, recovered his composure quickly, offering a measured response that preserved as much dignity as the situation allowed. "Your Grace, I appreciate your honesty, difficult as it may be to hear. Perhaps it would be best if we discuss these matters privately, away from the full household." "Of course," Julian agreed, "though I wished for the full household to understand the reasoning behind my time here, disguised among them, and to know that whatever judgments were made about a simple stable hand's worth reflect directly upon the character of those who made them." Before the crowd could fully disperse, Lord Pelham's daughter approached Ilara with an expression of surprising warmth rather than the resentment Ilara had braced herself to encounter. "Miss Whitfield," she said quietly, drawing Ilara slightly aside from the curious eyes still lingering upon them, "I do not know you well, but I find myself grateful to you tonight, strange as that may sound." Grateful, my lady? Alara asked, uncertain how to respond to such an unexpected sentiment. I never wished for this match, the young woman admitted softly. I have long harbored an understanding with someone of my own choosing, a man my father would never have considered suitable given his modest fortune. I did not know how to voice my objections without causing great disappointment to my family, and now His Grace has resolved the matter entirely, through his own honest reflection rather than any fault of mine. I have you to thank for whatever influence helped him reach that honesty. Alara did not know how to respond to such a confession, still reeling from the weight of her own circumstances, but she managed a small, genuine smile. I wish you happiness, my lady, whatever path you now find yourself free to pursue. And I wish the same for you, the young woman replied, with a knowing look that made Alara's cheeks warm considerably, before she turned and rejoined her father, who was already deep in quiet, urgent conversation with Baron Ashworth regarding the evening's unexpected turn. The formal gathering dissolved shortly afterward into a flurry of hushed conversations and stunned whispers among the staff, everyone processing the extraordinary events of the evening in their own way. Alara found herself surrounded by curious glances and hesitant approaches from servants who had barely acknowledged her existence before that night, their sudden interest in her friendship with the Duke transparent and, in some cases, almost comically obsequious. Margaret Coyle, of all people, approached her with an expression caught somewhere between humiliation and desperate attempts at reconciliation. Alara, she began stiffly, I hope you understand that whatever I said before, I never meant any real harm. Alara looked at her former tormentor with something closer to pity than anger. I understand exactly what you meant, Margaret, but I hold no interest in dwelling on it now. She turned away before Margaret could respond further, making her way through the crowded hall toward the quiet of the corridor beyond, desperate for a moment of solitude to process the overwhelming events of the evening. She had barely reached the relative peace of the empty passageway when she heard footsteps behind her, and turned to find Julian following her, his formal composure softened now that they stood away from the crowd. Alara, he said quietly, I hope what I said tonight did not cause you undue embarrassment. Embarrassment is the least of what I am feeling right now, she admitted, her voice unsteady. Your Grace, I do not know what to make of any of this. You have upended not only my understanding of who you are, but potentially an entire arranged marriage, all within a single evening, and you did so in front of the entire household, with my name spoken aloud as though I were somehow responsible for such a dramatic turn. You are not responsible for my decisions, he said firmly. The choice to end pursuit of an arranged marriage built on obligation, rather than genuine feeling, was mine alone, made long before tonight, though I admit your presence in my life these past weeks confirmed what I had already begun to suspect about what I truly wanted from my future. And what is that? She asked, though some part of her already feared the answer, uncertain whether she was ready to hear it after such an overwhelming evening. A connection built on honesty, he said simply. A partner who values my character over my title, who would have shown me the same kindness whether I possessed a dukedom or nothing at all. I believe I found that in you, Alara, though I understand if the events of this evening, and the deception that preceded them, have made it difficult for you to trust in anything I say. She studied his face for a long moment, searching for any trace of performance or calculation, and found only the same sincere warmth she had come to know during their weeks together in the stables, unchanged despite the formal clothes and grand title now surrounding him. I still need time, she said softly. Everything has changed so quickly tonight, and I do not think it would be wise to make any decisions about my own feelings while still reeling from the shock of it all. That is entirely reasonable, he said, though she could see the effort it took him to accept her request gracefully. Take whatever time you need, Alara. I have waited this long to find someone who values genuine connection over title and fortune. I can wait a little longer for you to feel certain of your own heart. She left him standing in the corridor and returned to the servants' quarters, her mind and heart still reeling from the extraordinary events of the evening, uncertain how she would face tomorrow, or the days after, now that the truth had finally, irrevocably come to light. Grace was waiting for her when she arrived, having clearly heard the news that had already spread like wildfire through every corner of the household. Alara, Grace breathed, rising quickly from her seat by the window. Is it true? The stable hand, Tom? He is truly the Duke himself? Alara nodded wordlessly, too exhausted to explain the full complexity of everything she had learned and felt over the past day, and Grace crossed the room to embrace her tightly. I can scarcely believe it, Grace said, pulling back to study her friend's face. All this time, and none of us suspected a thing, except perhaps you, if the look on your face just now is any indication. I suspected something was different about him, Alara admitted quietly, sinking onto her narrow bed. I did not dare imagine it could be this. And how do you feel now, knowing the truth? Grace asked gently, sitting beside her. Alara considered the question carefully before answering, turning over the tangled mixture of emotions that had consumed her since the previous evening. I do not fully know, she admitted. I feel hurt by the deception, even understanding his reasons for it. I feel overwhelmed by what he said tonight, in front of the entire household. And beneath all of that, I feel something I am almost afraid to name, because naming it makes it real, and real feelings toward a duke seem like the beginning of a story that could only end in heartbreak for someone like me. Grace squeezed her hand gently. Perhaps, she said, or perhaps it could end in something neither of us has ever witnessed before. A story where kindness and honesty matter more than rank. Whatever you decide, Alara, I will support you completely. But do not let fear alone decide your heart's answer. Alara lay awake long after Grace had settled into her own bed and fallen asleep, staring at the shadows dancing across the ceiling, turning Grace's words over in her mind alongside every moment she had shared with the man once known only as Tom. Whatever tomorrow brought, she understood now that nothing in her life would ever return fully to how it had been before his arrival at Pelham Hall. A messenger arrived at Pelham Hall 3 days after the formal announcement, carrying a letter addressed directly to Alara, sealed with wax bearing an unfamiliar crest. She opened it with trembling hands in the privacy of the linen closet, her eyes widening as she read the contents. The letter confirmed that her family's debt had been resolved in full, the merchant paid and the matter settled quietly, through arrangements made by a solicitor acting on behalf of an anonymous benefactor. Her father would receive proper medical care from a physician traveling from the capital, and her sister Clara would want for nothing while their father recovered his strength. The letter made no mention of Julian's name, no demand for gratitude or acknowledgement, simply a quiet, thorough resolution to every hardship that had weighed upon her family for years. Tears streamed down her face as she read the letter a second time, then a third, scarcely able to believe the weight that had lifted so suddenly from her shoulders. She thought of Julian's promise, spoken so earnestly beneath the bare oak tree days before, that he would help her family regardless of what happened between them, and she understood now that he had kept that promise without seeking anything in return, without even revealing his role in the resolution, unless she discovered it through her own inquiry. She found him later that afternoon in the estate's small library, reviewing documents with Baron Ashworth, and she waited until the Baron excused himself before stepping fully into the room. You resolved my family's debt, she said, still holding the letter tightly in her hands. Julian looked up from his papers, his expression carefully neutral, though she could see the hope flickering behind his composed exterior. I told you I would help your family, regardless of what you decided about us. You did not have to keep that promise so completely, she said, her voice thick with emotion. You could have offered a small sum, enough to ease the burden without solving it entirely. Instead, you have given my father proper medical care, resolved a debt that has haunted us for years, and asked for nothing in return. I did not offer help expecting anything in return, he said simply. Your family's well-being matters to me, Alara, independent of whatever you eventually decide regarding your feelings toward me. I could not, in good conscience, allow people I care about to suffer when I possessed the means to ease their burden. She crossed the room slowly, setting the letter down on the table beside him. I have spent the past 3 days trying to untangle everything I feel, she admitted. The hurt of your deception, however well-intentioned, the shock of learning who you truly are. And beneath all of that, something I have been afraid to fully acknowledge. And what is that? He asked softly, rising from his seat to face her directly. That none of it changes what I already knew about your character, she said. You showed me kindness when you had every reason to remain guarded. You listened to my troubles as though they mattered, long before you revealed any hint of your true station. And now you have resolved my family's greatest hardship without seeking any acknowledgement for it. Whatever title you carry, Julian, the man beneath it remains exactly who I believed him to be during our weeks together in the stables. Hope bloomed openly across his face now, the careful composure he had maintained since the formal announcement finally breaking into something warmer and more vulnerable. Does this mean you have forgiven the deception? I understand it now, better than I did 3 days ago, she said. You sought honesty in a world that offered you little of it, and you found it in the last place anyone expected to look. I cannot fault you for that, even if the path there caused me pain along the way. He reached for her hands, and she let him take them, the warmth of his touch familiar despite the fine clothes and formal title now surrounding him. Alara, I know I have asked a great deal of your patience and understanding these past weeks, but I would ask one thing more of you now, if you will permit it. What is that? She asked, her heart racing with anticipation. Allow me to court you properly, he said, Openly, honestly, without any hidden names or false identities standing between us. Allow me to show you who I truly am, Duke and man both, and to learn in return everything about you that I have not yet had the privilege of discovering. Tears welled in her eyes again, though this time entirely from joy rather than grief. I would like that very much, she said softly. Baron Ashworth, watching the exchange from across the library, allowed himself a rare smile as he gathered his papers to give the couple privacy. He had served Julian's family for over a decade, and he had watched the young Duke grow increasingly weary and guarded following the death of his parents, surrounded always by people who valued his fortune far more than his friendship. Seeing genuine joy return to his employer's expression after so many difficult years brought the Baron a satisfaction he had not expected to feel so deeply. "Your Grace," the Baron said before departing, "if I may say so, I have not seen you look this contented in a very long time." "Thank you, Ashworth," Julian replied, still holding Alara's hands gently in his own. "I owe a great deal of that contentment to Miss Whitfield's patience with an old fool who thought disguising himself as a stable hand was a clever solution to his troubles." "A clever solution indeed," the Baron said with a knowing chuckle, given how thoroughly it succeeded. He bowed respectfully to them both, and left the library, closing the door quietly behind him. Alara laughed softly at the exchange, some of the lingering tension from the past days finally easing from her shoulders. "Your Baron seems fond of you, despite the trouble you have caused him these past months." "Ashworth has served my family faithfully since before I inherited my title," Julian explained. "He was among the very few people I trusted enough to confide in when I decided to travel incognito. He thought the plan reckless at first, though he has since admitted it produced results far beyond anything he anticipated." The weeks that followed brought changes to Pelham Hall that few among the staff could have predicted. Julian remained at the estate longer than his original visit had intended, spending his days in open courtship of Alara, walking with her through the estate's gardens, sharing meals together in ways that scandalized some among the more traditional staff while delighting others who had grown fond of Alara over her years of service. Margaret Coyle, humbled considerably by the revelation of Tom's true identity, made careful efforts to treat Alara with newfound respect, though Alara noticed the change came more from fear of consequence than genuine remorse. She accepted the shift in behavior gracefully nonetheless, unwilling to hold on to bitterness when so much genuine happiness now filled her days. Grace remained Alara's closest confidant throughout the courtship, delighting in every detail Alara shared with her, though she teased her friend mercilessly about the sudden transformation from stable hand's companion to a Duke's intended. "I always said you deserved someone who truly saw you," Grace told her one evening, as they sat together in the servants' garden watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. "I simply never imagined it would be quite so dramatic a revelation." Alara laughed, a genuine, unguarded sound that had grown more frequent in the weeks since Julian's true identity had come to light. "Neither did I, if I am honest. I thought I was simply being kind to a stranger who needed it." "And look where that kindness has led you," Grace said, squeezing her hand affectionately. In the weeks before the proposal, Julian insisted on accompanying Alara on a visit to her family's modest home, wanting to meet Edmund and Clara Whitfield properly, without the pretense of any hidden identity between them. Alara had worried over the visit for days beforehand, uncertain how her father, a proud man despite his failing health, would receive a Duke into their humble home. Her worries proved unfounded. Edmund Whitfield greeted Julian with the same quiet dignity he brought to everything in his life, and though he was clearly overwhelmed by the presence of such an important guest, he spoke to Julian plainly and honestly, asking pointed questions about his intentions toward his daughter, that made Alara blush with embarrassment, even as she felt a swell of pride at her father's courage. "You understand," Edmund said carefully, "that my daughter has never sought wealth or position. She has worked hard her entire life, simply to keep our family together. I would not wish to see her enter a marriage where she is valued only for the novelty of her humble origins, forgotten once that novelty fades." "I understand your concern completely, sir," Julian replied, meeting the older man's gaze steadily. "I can only offer you my word that my feelings for Alara developed entirely before I ever revealed my title to her, and that I have watched her demonstrate the same genuine character in every circumstance since, whether facing hardship or unexpected fortune. I do not intend to forget the woman who showed me kindness when she believed I had nothing to offer her in return." Edmund studied him for a long moment before nodding slowly, apparently satisfied by the sincerity in the young Duke's voice. "Then you have my blessing, Your Grace, though I suspect my daughter would have made her own choice regardless of my opinion." Alara laughed through sudden tears at her father's words, and Julian's answering smile carried a warmth that convinced her entirely of the rightness of the path unfolding before them. Clara, meanwhile, had spent much of the visit staring at Julian with undisguised awe, though by its end she had grown comfortable enough to tease him gently about his brief career as a stable hand, a jest he accepted with good humor that endeared him further to Alara's family. As autumn deepened into winter, Julian formally requested Alara's hand in marriage, not in the grand, public spectacle that had marked his revelation months before, but in a quiet, private moment in the very stables where their friendship had first blossomed. He knelt beside the same paddock fence where they had shared so many evening conversations, the horses shifting gently in their stalls nearby, and asked her to become his wife not as a duke commanding acceptance, but as a man humbly hoping for a future built on genuine love. Alara accepted through tears of joy, understanding fully now that the man kneeling before her, dressed once more in simple clothes for this most important of moments, remained exactly who he had always been, beneath every title and circumstance. Someone who valued kindness and honesty above all else. Someone who had found in her the genuine connection he had spent years searching for, in vain, among the noble circles that surrounded his birth. Their wedding, when it finally occurred the following spring, brought together the grandest nobility of the land, alongside the humblest servants who had once worked beside Alara at Pelham Hall. Julian insisted that every member of the household staff who had shown genuine kindness during his time in disguise receive proper recognition and reward, and he made a point of personally thanking each of them, including the head groom who had never once treated the mysterious stable hand with anything but fair, respectful dignity, despite never fully understanding the reasons behind such careful treatment. Alara's father, his health restored through proper care and treatment, walked her down the aisle with tears of pride streaming down his weathered face, and her sister Clara stood as her attendant, radiant with happiness for the sister who had sacrificed so much to support their family through years of hardship. As Alara stood beside Julian at the altar, exchanging vows that promised honesty and genuine partnership above all else, she thought back to that first evening in the stable yard, when she had wrapped a stranger's wounded arm with strips of clean linen, never imagining that simple act of decency would lead her to this moment, standing beside the man she loved, about to become a duchess despite having been born with nothing beyond her own character to recommend her. The household staff who had once mocked and dismissed the quiet stable hand now bowed respectfully as their new duchess passed, and though Alara never sought such deference for herself, she understood the deeper meaning behind the transformation, a reminder to everyone present that true worth could never be measured by station or circumstance, but only by the genuine kindness a person chose to extend to others, regardless of what they might receive in return. Julian squeezed her hand gently as they turned to face their assembled guests, husband and wife at last, and in his eyes she saw not a duke addressing his subjects, but simply a man who had found, in the last place anyone expected, the genuine connection he had spent his entire life searching for. Their story spread throughout the countryside in the months that followed, whispered among servants and nobility alike. A tale of a duke who had disguised himself as a humble stable hand to discover the true character of those around him, and the one servant girl whose unwavering kindness had shown him exactly what he had been searching for all along. And though the grand title of Duchess now belonged to her, Alara never forgot the lessons of those early weeks in the stable yard, carrying forward into her new life the same simple, genuine kindness that had first drawn Julian to her, extending it now to everyone she encountered, noble and servant alike, understanding fully that true nobility had never been about birth or title at all, but about the quiet, consistent choice to treat every person with the dignity and warmth they deserved. At the wedding feast that evening, Grace found a quiet moment to sit beside Alara, both of them watching the celebration unfold around them with matching expressions of wonder. "Do you remember," Grace asked softly, "warning me once that Margaret was simply inventing scandal where none existed, when I first mentioned the whispers about you and the stable hand?" Alara smiled at the memory, still fresh despite everything that had happened since. "I remember insisting there was nothing between us beyond simple kindness. And now look at you," Grace said, gesturing toward the grand hall filled with nobility, "come to celebrate the marriage of a duke to a woman who had once mended stockings and served tea for her living. I could not have imagined such an ending, even in my wildest daydreams." "Neither could I," Alara admitted. "I only knew that a stranger needed kindness, and that I was capable of offering it. I never imagined it would lead to any of this." Julian appeared beside them then, extending his hand toward his new wife with the same gentle warmth he had shown her since their very first conversation by the stable door. "May I steal you away for a dance, my Duchess?" Alara rose and took his hand, allowing him to lead her toward the center of the hall as music swelled around them, and their assembled guests looked on with warm approval. As they moved together through the steps of the dance, she caught sight of her father watching from his seat, pride and joy shining plainly on his face, and her sister Clara laughing with several of the household staff who had traveled from Pelham Hall to witness the celebration. "Any regrets?" Julian asked softly as they turned together beneath the glittering chandeliers. "Only that I did not know sooner what a simple act of kindness could lead to," she said, smiling up at him. "Then let us spend the rest of our lives discovering exactly that," he replied, "together, and in full honesty, from this day forward." And as the music continued and the celebration stretched long into the night, Ilara understood that whatever grand title she now carried, the truest measure of her happiness lay not in the splendor surrounding her, but in the simple, enduring truth that had brought her to this moment, that kindness, offered freely and without expectation, had the power to transform not only the life of the person who received it, but the life of the person who gave it as well. Snow fell heavily over Ravensworth Manor as Ilara stood at the window of her new sitting room, watching the flakes settle across gardens far grander than anything she had known at Pelham Hall. 6 months had passed since her wedding, and though she had grown steadily more comfortable in her role as Duchess, moments still arose when the sheer scale of her new life caught her by surprise. A knock sounded at the door, and Julian entered without waiting for her response, a privilege she had long since granted him. "You are thinking again," he said, crossing the room to stand beside her at the window. "I can always tell by the particular stillness in your shoulders." "I was thinking of home," she admitted. "Not this home, though I have grown to love it, but the small rooms above my father's old workshop, where Clara and I used to share a single candle for reading in the evenings." "Do you miss it?" he asked, genuine concern in his voice. "Sometimes," she said honestly. "Not the hardship, but the simplicity of it. Here, every day brings new expectations, new ceremonies, new people watching to see whether the stable hands Duchess will stumble over some point of etiquette she was never taught." Julian took her hand gently. "You have never once stumbled, Ilara. If anything, you have taught this household more about genuine kindness than any etiquette manual ever could." He paused, considering something. "Perhaps it is time we visited Pelham Hall again. The staff there still speak of you fondly, from what Ashworth tells me, and I know your friend Grace has written asking when you might return." Ilara's face brightened immediately at the suggestion. "I would like that very much." They departed for Pelham Hall within the week, and their arrival caused considerable excitement among the household staff, many of whom had not seen Ilara since her wedding months before. Grace embraced her tightly the moment she stepped from the carriage, tears of happiness in her eyes. "You look wonderful," Grace said, holding her at arm's length to study her properly. "Marriage clearly suits you, Ilara. Or perhaps it is simply happiness that suits you so well." "Perhaps a bit of both," Ilara said, laughing. Mrs. Fenwick, considerably more deferential now than she had ever been during Ilara's years of service, greeted the couple with elaborate formality, though Ilara noticed a genuine warmth beneath the careful courtesy that had not existed before. Even Margaret Coyle, who had continued working at Pelham Hall despite the humiliation of her past cruelty coming to light, approached with a bow and a carefully worded greeting that Ilara accepted graciously, holding no lingering resentment toward a woman who had simply behaved as she had been taught to behave, within a rigid, unforgiving system. During their visit, Julian requested a private meeting with the household staff, gathering everyone in the same great hall where he had first revealed his true identity months before. The servants exchanged nervous glances, uncertain what such a gathering might portend. "I wish to speak with all of you," Julian began, "not to revisit the events of my time here in disguise, but to share something I have decided since returning to my own estate. I have established a fund, administered jointly by Lord Pelham's household and my own solicitors, intended to support the families of any servant who falls upon hardship through illness, debt, or misfortune beyond their control. No family working within these households should face the kind of desperate struggle that once threatened the woman who is now my wife." Murmurs of surprise and gratitude swept through the assembled staff, and Ilara felt tears prick at her eyes, moved deeply by her husband's continued commitment to the values that had first drawn them together. "Furthermore," Julian continued, "I have asked Mrs. Fenwick to establish a formal system, ensuring that every member of staff, regardless of position, receives fair and respectful treatment from their superiors. Cruelty and mockery, however casual or commonplace it may have seemed before, will no longer be tolerated within any household I have influence over." The staff received this announcement with evident relief, several of the younger servants exchanging hopeful glances at the prospect of protection from the casual cruelties that had long characterized life in service. Ilara watched her husband address the household with quiet pride, understanding fully now how deeply his time as a disguised stable hand had shaped not only his understanding of her character, but his broader sense of responsibility toward everyone who served within his sphere of influence. Henry Dobbs approached Elara privately before the celebration began, bowing with genuine respect rather than the nervous formality he had shown during her time as a servant. "Your Grace," he said, still adjusting to the proper address, "I wanted to thank you personally, if I may. Working under His Grace's disguise these past months taught me a great deal about patience and discretion, but it was watching your kindness toward him, offered so freely without any expectation of reward, that taught me the most valuable lesson of all." "You have nothing to thank me for, Henry," Elara said warmly. "You showed His Grace respect and discretion when it mattered most, keeping his secret safe through some very close calls, if I recall correctly." Henry smiled at the memory. "That visiting steward very nearly undid everything, did he not? I still remember the look on his face when he realized his mistake." "I remember it well," Elara said, laughing softly at the shared memory, though it took me weeks afterward to fully understand what that moment truly meant. The head groom, too, found a quiet moment to speak with her, his weathered face carrying an expression of genuine humility she had not expected from a man who had once assigned Tom the estate's most difficult and thankless tasks. "I did not treat him fairly," the groom admitted plainly, "and I have thought of it often since learning the truth. I hope you will believe me when I say it was ignorance rather than cruelty that guided my actions, though I understand that offers little comfort now." "I believe you," Elara said gently. "And I know Julian holds no lasting resentment toward you either. He has spoken often of your skill with the horses, and of how much he learned from working alongside you, even under circumstances neither of you fully understood at the time." The old groom's eyes grew misty at her words, and he thanked her before returning to his duties, visibly lightened by the exchange. Later that evening, as the formal gathering dissolved into a more relaxed celebration marking the couple's visit, Elara found herself once again in the familiar surroundings of the stable yard, standing near the very paddock fence where she had first bandaged Julian's injured arm all those months before. "It feels strange to stand here now," she said, as Julian joined her beside the fence, remembering how it all began. "Strange in a good way, or a difficult way?" he asked. "Both, perhaps," she said, smiling. "I think of the girl I was then, worried constantly about her family's survival, never imagining her life could change so completely. And I think of the frightened, guarded man who could barely accept a simple gift of bread without questioning the motive behind it. We have both changed a great deal since then," Julian agreed, wrapping an arm gently around her shoulders. "Yet somehow," Elara said, leaning into him, "the most important parts of who we were then remain exactly the same. You are still the man who calmed frightened horses with nothing more than a steady voice and patient hands. I am still the woman who believes kindness matters more than any title or fortune." "That is precisely why this has worked," Julian said softly. "We did not fall in love with a duke and a servant girl. We fell in love with two people who recognized genuine goodness in each other, long before either of us understood what that recognition would eventually cost, or reward us with." They stood together in comfortable silence as evening settled over the estate, the same horses shifting quietly in their stalls nearby, the same stars beginning to emerge overhead that had witnessed so many of their early conversations. Grace found them there a while later, carrying 2 cups of warm cider she had brought from the kitchen. "I thought you might want these," Grace said, handing the cups over with a knowing smile. "Though I suspect you two have grown quite accustomed to finer refreshments at Ravensworth Manor." "Nothing tastes finer than Pelham Hall's cider on a cold evening," Elara said, accepting the cup gratefully. "Some things remain unmatched, regardless of how grand one's new circumstances might become." Grace laughed and left them to their quiet reunion, and as Elara sipped the warm, familiar drink beside her husband in the very place their unlikely love story had begun, she reflected on how completely her life had transformed since that first morning she had noticed a struggling stranger fighting to calm a frightened horse. She thought of her father, now fully recovered and managing a small workshop once more, though with considerably less financial worry than before. She thought of Clara, recently betrothed to a kind young merchant who valued her intelligence and spirit above all else. She thought of Grace, who had recently accepted a position as head housekeeper at a neighboring estate, a promotion Elara suspected had been quietly influenced by a certain duke's recommendation, though Julian had never openly admitted to arranging it. Most of all, she thought of the simple truth that had guided her through every uncertain moment of the past year, that kindness, offered without expectation of reward, possessed a power far greater than any title or fortune could provide. It had transformed a lonely, guarded duke into a man capable of genuine love. It had transformed a hard-working servant girl into a duchess who never forgot the values that had shaped her humble beginnings. And it had transformed an entire household's understanding of what true nobility actually meant. As the last light faded from the sky above Pelham Hall, Julian took her hand once more, and together they walked back toward the grand house where their story had first unfolded, ready to return home to Ravensworth Manor the following morning, carrying with them not only the memories of their extraordinary beginning, but the certainty that whatever challenges the future might bring, they would face them together, exactly as they had promised each other on the evening their truth had finally come to light. Their story remained, for years afterward, a favorite tale told among the servants of Pelham Hall and Ravensworth Manor alike, a reminder passed down through generations of household staff that genuine character could never be hidden by circumstance, nor genuine kindness ever go unnoticed, regardless of how humble the setting in which it was first offered.